Horror story. Ever since he could walk, little Jacob had an insatiable curiosity. He wasn't like other kids who spent their days glued to screens or playing games in the safety of their yards. No, Jacob was always running. Running to see what was beyond the next hill, running to explore what was hidden behind the trees at the edge of town. He loved the thrill of the unknown, the excitement that came with discovering something no one else had seen before. And, more than anything, Jacob had a habit of disappearing for hours without telling anyone where he was going. His parents had learned to worry less about his little adventures. "He'll come home when he's hungry," his mother would say with a laugh, though she always made sure to glance out the window, keeping an eye on the shadows that crept longer in the late afternoons. His father, a man of few words, would simply shake his head and mutter about boys needing their freedom, as long as they didn't stray too far. But the thing about Jacob was that he always wanted to stray just a little farther than he had before. One warm summer day, the kind of day when the air hangs heavy and thick like a blanket, Jacob felt the pull of the forest more than usual. He had ventured into those woods before, but only ever skimming the edges, never too deep. There were stories, of course, tales of strange things lurking in the heart of the forest, stories meant to scare children into staying close to home. Jacob never put much stock in those tales. To him, the forest was a place of adventure, not of fear. He left his house early that morning as the sun was just starting to burn away the last wisps of dawn fog. His parents were still asleep and he didn't bother to leave a note. They wouldn't worry until the evening and by then he'd be back. He always came back. The forest welcomed him like an old friend, the trees towering high above, their branches swaying lazily in the breeze. Birds chirped, and the underbrush rustled with the movements of small creatures. It felt alive in a way that the town never did. Here, Jacob wasn't just a little boy, he was an explorer, a pioneer in a land where no one had walked before. As he ventured deeper, the woods grew quieter. The birdsong faded until all he could hear was the sound of his own footsteps on the soft earth. The trees, once spaced widely enough to let beams of sunlight filter through, now stood closer together, their thick trunks and tangled branches casting long, dark shadows. The ground beneath his feet grew softer, more spongy, like the forest itself was changing, drawing him in, transforming with each step he took. Jacob didn't mind. He liked the quiet. It made him feel like he was on the verge of discovering something truly special, something only he could find. He pressed on, further than he had ever gone before, weaving between the trees, feeling the damp, cool air brush against his skin. He wasn't sure how long he had been walking when he first realized the path had disappeared. The little trail of trampled leaves and snapped twigs that he had been following had simply faded away, swallowed by the thick carpet of moss and vines that stretched out in all directions. He stopped, glancing around, a frown tugging at the corners of his mouth. There was no sign of where he had come from, no familiar landmarks to guide him back. It was as if the forest had shifted around him, rearranging itself while he wasn't looking. Jacob took a deep breath. He wasn't scared, not yet. He had always been good at finding his way home before, and this time would be no different. He turned back the way he thought he had come and started walking. But with each step, the forest seemed to close in on him. The trees grew even closer, their branches gnarled and twisted like the fingers of an ancient, unseen creature. The further he went, the darker it got. The canopy above had thickened, blotting out the sun entirely. What little light remained was strange and greenish, casting long shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of his eye. He picked up the pace, his feet crunching on dry leaves and snapping twigs. But the more he hurried, the more he realized he wasn't getting any closer to the edge of the forest. In fact, it felt like he was being drawn deeper. That's when Jacob first heard this sound. It was faint at first, so soft he almost thought he imagined it. A low, melodic humming, like the voice of someone far away, calling out in a language he didn't understand. It wasn't loud or threatening, but it sent a chill down his spine nonetheless. He stopped in his tracks, straining to listen, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The humming grew louder, more distinct, and now he could hear something else beneath it, something moving in the underbrush. A rustling like the sound of many feet or many legs. For the first time, Jacob felt the creeping tendrils of fear clawing at the edges of his mind. He glanced around, searching the thick underbrush for the source of the sound, but there was nothing. The forest around him was still, unnervingly so. Even the breeze that had stirred the trees earlier was gone. The only movement came from the shadows. Shadows that seemed to be shifting, stretching, as if alive. The humming was louder now, too loud to ignore. It seemed to be coming from deeper within the forest, further off the non-existent path he had been following. Against his better judgment, Jacob found himself drawn to it, his feet moving of their own accord. The fear in his chest was growing, but so was his curiosity. What could be making that sound? What lay deeper in the forest, waiting for him to discover? His steps slowed as he reached a small clearing. The air here felt different, colder, like the warmth of the summer day had been snuffed out entirely. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its trunk black and twisted, its branches bare despite the season. It towered above him, ancient and imposing, and at its base was a small, dark opening, an entrance to something hidden beneath the earth. Jacob stared at it, the humming now vibrating through his bones. He took a step closer, his hand reaching out as if to touch the tree, as if the answer to his questions lay just beyond that dark entrance. The fear had faded, replaced with an overwhelming sense of need, the need to know, to find out what was hidden in the depths of this forgotten forest. He took another step, and another, and as his foot crossed the threshold of the tree's shadow, the ground gave way beneath him and Jacob fell. Jacob's parents had grown used to his little adventures. He was always darting off somewhere, exploring the town, the fields, or the edge of the woods. They didn't mind much. He always came back, muddy and wide-eyed, with some new story about the bugs he had seen or the hidden places he had found. But on that warm summer day, when the sun had climbed high in the sky and Jacob still hadn't returned for lunch, they began to worry. At first, it was nothing more than a fleeting thought. His mother glanced at the clock, then at the back door, waiting to hear the familiar sound of his small feet padding across the floor. But the house remained silent, except for the ticking of the old kitchen clock. She frowned, setting down the knife she had been using to chop vegetables, and peered out the window into the backyard. It was empty. Her gaze swept across the yard, searching for any sign of him. Maybe he was hiding, playing one of his games. She called his name, expecting his mischievous giggle to echo from behind the shed or the tall grass, but there was no answer. The uneasy feeling in her stomach started to grow. She called again, louder this time. Nothing. Her voice carried through the still air, the sound almost swallowed by the quiet. Something was off. She couldn't place it yet, but the day felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. Even the usual summer hum of insects seemed to have faded into silence. A knot of anxiety tightened in her chest as she wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, calling once more for Jacob. Her husband, hearing the calls, emerged from the garage where he had been fixing the lawnmower. He wiped the grease from his hands and joined her in the yard, his brow furrowed. "What's wrong?" he asked, glancing around. "Where's Jacob?" "He's not answering," she said, her voice tight with worry. "I thought he might be playing, but I don't see him anywhere." Together they searched the yard, calling his name louder and louder. But it was no use. There was no sign of Jacob, just an unsettling silence that hung in the air, growing heavier with each passing minute. "Maybe he's wandered off again," her husband said, though there was an edge to his voice now, a tremor that hadn't been there before. Jacob had always returned quickly when they called. This time was different. He hadn't come running. He hadn't giggled from a hidden spot. He was simply gone. They moved towards the edge of the yard, scanning the tall grass that separated their property from the edge of the woods. And that's when they saw it, small, unmistakable footprints pressed into the soft earth, leading away from the yard and into the dense forest beyond. "He's gone into the woods," her husband muttered, more to himself than to her. His voice was low, but she could hear the worry creeping into it. The woods. Jacob had gone into the woods before, but never without telling them. And never this deep. Something about the sight of those small footprints, so innocent, leading into the dark tangle of trees made her stomach turn. The woods had always been strange, too quiet, too dense. They had always warned Jacob not to go too far in. "Let's follow his tracks," she said, her voice firmer now, though her heart was pounding in her chest. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. The two of them set off into the forest, calling his name as they followed the faint trail of footprints. The atmosphere shifted almost immediately. The deeper they went, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as if the forest was watching them, holding its breath. They tried to stay calm, shouting for Jacob, but the further they walked, the quieter their voices felt, swallowed up by the dense canopy above. The trail of footprints was erratic, as though Jacob had wandered aimlessly, zigzagging through the trees. But they kept following, determined to catch up to him. At first, they were relieved to see the tracks continuing. They hadn't vanished, not yet. But the deeper they went, the more unsettling the forest became. The birds had gone silent. There was no familiar hum of insects or rustling of leaves. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath, watching them. Then, without warning, a sudden rush of movement broke the stillness. A flock of birds, hidden high in the branches, took off all at once, screeching and flapping in wild panic. It was as if they had sensed something terrible, something unseen. Their wings beat the air in a frenzy, and the couple froze, watching in stunned silence as the birds disappeared into the darkening sky. The change came quickly after that. The air, once thick with warmth, turned cool, almost suffocating. The trees seemed to loom taller, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, casting long, unnatural shadows. The light dimmed, fading so rapidly that it felt as if dusk had fallen in the span of mere moments. A sense of dread settled over the couple, heavy and oppressive. "I don't like this," Jacob's mother whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden rush of wind that swept through the trees. "We need to find him. Now." But just as they were about to call out again, something caught their eye. A shape, low to the ground, moving between the trees. At first they thought it was a deer, until it stepped into the clearing ahead of them. It was a jackrabbit, or at least it looked like one. But something was wrong. Its fur was patchy and matted with dirt, and its head hung low as if the weight of the world pressed down on it. But the most horrifying detail was its face. It had no eyes. Where its eyes should have been, there was only smooth, unbroken skin, pale and waxy. Yet, as the rabbit turned its head toward them, they felt a sickening jolt of fear deep in their chests. It was looking at them, seeing them, despite the lack of eyes. Its gaze was cold, piercing, as if it knew something about them, something it wasn't supposed to. The jackrabbit remained still for a moment, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, without warning, it bolted toward them with terrifying speed. Jacob's father barely had time to react before the rabbit was upon them, moving in a blur of motion. Its body twisted and contorted as it lunged at them, and for a split second Jacob's mother caught a glimpse of its mouth, far too wide, filled with sharp, jagged teeth. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the forest. The air seemed to fold in on itself, and within seconds the clearing was consumed by darkness, as if the world itself had been plunged into night. And then, silence. The footprints stopped. The calls for Jacob faded. And in that moment, as the last echo of the jackrabbit's terrifying rush dissolved into the shadows, the family was gone. Not a trace remained. No footprints. No sound. No sign of struggle. Just an empty clearing in a darkening forest, where the birds no longer sang, and where something far more ancient and terrifying had claimed its latest prey.